Energy media readers, today we have a real treat for you because we would like to welcome Sandy Garossino of the National Observer to our little interview, and welcome, Sandy.
Nice to be here, Markham. Thanks for having me.
Now, many of the energy media readers will remember the articles that Sandy wrote about how foundations, particularly American foundations, fund environmental groups' activities in Canada, and that, of course, has been a source of tremendous controversy in Alberta, in particular, because, of course, some of them are found. Some of that money went to groups that are fighting Alberta pipelines, and so. Sandy, what I'd like you to do, can you give us an overview of the foundations, how the foundations function, and what you found in your investigation?
Okay, well, probably the most important thing that people need to know are the vectors and channels, which foundations are involved in which sectors, because they're involved in different sectors and have different purposes, and how they function, what mechanisms they use to finance, what their purposes of financing are, and where the money goes. Now, I think for most Albertans are probably really focused on what's called the tar sands campaign, which is a loose affiliation, and there's some variation in recipient groups. There are about between 60 and 100 participating Canadian organizations. Some of them have charitable status, some of them do not. And they are funded by Canadians, they are funded by large international foundations, largely American, but that composition has also shifted over time, and one of the other major funders is out of Switzerland. There's a lot of misunderstanding about the tar sands campaign. Just as an example, Tides Canada has nothing to do with the tar sands campaign. Tides Canada has not been involved in anti-pipeline and anti-oil sands activity.
And I think, I know I pointed this out in columns because I interviewed Joanna Kerr, the CEO of Tides Canada. She says that researchers who are making the allegations around foreign-funded activists and some of the politicians like Jason Kenney who have adopted that critique just confuse Tides Canada with Tides Foundation in the US.
Well, they do, but there's another aspect. They are also confusing. They're also mixing apples and oranges because they confuse conservation funding, of which there's a significant amount, which has also involved the Canadian government, including the Harper government, with activist funding. And sometimes it's easy to understand how that confusion happens because oftentimes environmental groups that are involved in conservation projects also, as another part of their activities, are activists about fossil fuels and the oil sands. But to fund an organization for one purpose, to assist, for instance, in building a sustainable indigenous fishery in the Great Bear Rainforest, in the oceans around the Great Bear Rainforest, is not the same thing as battling against pipelines.
One of the things you did that I thought, I was really impressed with this, by the way, is the time that you spent in the database that you had access to, and you tracked all of this money from the various foundations, or most of it anyway, to the Canadian environmental groups. Could you tell us about that?
Okay, well, I went into a database that is operated by an organization called Candid, and they track every charitable dollar that is given by foundations and U.S. government agencies in the United States, and most of the large foundation grants globally. So they track trillions of dollars in grants, including a very large number by the U.S. government. And it's also very easily searchable. It's tabulated, cross-referenced. There's a huge amount of data just going into that. And so what I was able to do was to go in and check to see Well, who's funding environmental issues around the world? What percentage of global charitable donations go to environmental issues relative to, say, health, education, etc.? Of the environmental funding, what percentage goes to climate action versus conservation or research or other initiatives? Of that climate action funding, how much goes to Canada, how much goes to the US, to Europe, to India, China, Africa, and other jurisdictions? So I was able to really tease out the extent to which Canada is a recipient.
So walk us through this, Sandy, because it sounds, I know when I read it, I understood it reasonably well. When I hear you describe it, it gets a little complex. So can you walk us through that, please?
Okay, well, just to give some sense of where this all stands, since, according to Canada's data, since 2009, over 100,000 charitable foundations and non-governmental funders have granted about $700 billion to recipient organizations worldwide for all purposes. Of that number, about 1,800 foundations have granted about $5 billion specifically to climate initiatives. But of those 1,800 foundations and the $5 billion, only 5 foundations have granted about half that figure. It's just a really, you know, that whole inequality dynamic that you hear about, that really plays out in granting around the world on just about any issue. But American-based recipients received about $3 billion, or 59% of all climate grants worldwide that were tracked by this organization, Candid. And about $2 billion was divided between the EU, China, and India. And there were a few other recipients, Latin America, for instance, the Amazon rainforest got some, Africa got some, but of the $5 billion granted worldwide, only about $51 million went to Canadian climate projects. About 80% of that, or $40 million, went to small organizations participating in the tar sands campaign.
Now, this is really interesting because without that context, $40 million sounds like a lot of money over 10 years. Yep. But when you put it in the bigger context, it really is only a tiny amount, isn't it?
It's just it's a smidgen. I think, what is it, about 1%? I haven't done the calculations lately, but it's a small, almost infinitesimally small percentage of all climate grants worldwide.
And one of the points, and I don't know if you were able to tease this out, but one of the allegations that was leveled during the last little while is that international foundations were funding First Nation judicial, the challenges against Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. And I know I talked to Tim Pearson at Sierra BC, and he said, no, that money was all raised in Canada. Did you discover anything about that? American foundations funding legal First Nations legal challenges against pipelines.
Well, I didn't see specifically legal funding, and there's a huge amount of huge granular detail, and I was looking at things from a meta point of view. I believe the largest funder of Indigenous organizations and Indigenous activism against the pipelines comes from the Oak Foundation, which is a Swiss environmental funder. And one of the things for people to be aware of is that funding Indigenous communities worldwide is a priority for almost all the major foundations, not because they are taking a position about the merits of whatever the Indigenous communities are advocating for, but simply to support them.
I want you to address an allegation that really lies at the heart of the conspiracy narrative around the tar sands campaign. And that is that, in fact, it was the American foundations that initiated the tar sands campaign. It was their impetus to do that. And I think you found something different.
Well, yes. I mean, part of this, I did a lot of data searching, so that was my primary search, but I also conducted interviews, and I interviewed a number of people who were there at the inception and as part of all the activism that surrounded this. And really the impetus came from Canadians who then engaged the services of a guy by the name of Michael Marks, and people who are deeply, deep divers in this will recognize him as being part of the Corporate Ethics International organization, which is really just his home-based, home office, single employee consulting business. But he was engaged as a consultant by Pembina, by Forest Ethics, which is now STAND, and by other organizations to assist them in accessing the large grants that have been available.
And these kinds of arrangements are not uncommon, are they?
No, they're not uncommon. I mean, this is, like I say, there's hundreds of billions of dollars that over the last 10 years that have been granted by large foundations. You look at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Pew Charitable Trusts, the Hewlett Foundation, Packard Foundation, all of these foundations, and including the Rockefeller family of foundations, all of them have really revolutionized philanthropy, but they have done that in a variety of areas: women's rights, contraception, education, health, vaccine advocacy, everything. It's actually a remarkable world to drill into, because we in Canada we have large foundations, but I don't really think we have anything on the scale of the large American family foundations.
Now, there is and I've forgotten what it means. I think it's DPA is the initials. And could you explain how that functions?
You mean the donor advised funds, the DAFs?
Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
That's what you mean. So this is another area where there's been huge misinformation. So again, let me just explain that donor advised funds operate like the Calgary Foundation, like the Vancouver Foundation, like the Trillium Fund, and other large foundations in Canada, which is that large foundations or families who want to set something up, they want funds to be administered and then distributed by a larger body that has expertise in the area of charitable grants, and they will make a donation and earmark it and say, I want this to go to this purpose. And the Calgary Foundation or the Vancouver Foundation, depending on the degree of advice and involvement that you want from the foundation, they will distribute it. But it's also a very sophisticated, highly developed field that is used by all the major foundations. Over 90% of all international grants are run through the conduit of what are called donor advised funds.
Now, the donor advised funds, as I understand it, includes Tides Foundation, the much reviled Tides Foundation, and it in fact has not put, as I understand it from your work, has not put any of its own money into the tar sands campaign. It was simply placing funds from other foundations. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's correct. Neither Tides nor Tides Canada, which operates on the donor advised fund model, and Tides US works with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have worked with the Warren Buffett Family Foundation. All of the platinum global foundations have worked with them to distribute grants. And what they do is they take funds in, maybe that's for the purpose of pooling. So maybe you'll have 2 or 3 foundations that want to pool together on a joint project. That's actually how the tar sands campaign operates, is that it's pooled funds that come in from Generally speaking, the three largest foundations are Hewlett, the Oak Foundation, and then the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is a much smaller contributor, and then a variety of very small American foundation players. They pool funds, maybe in Tides, maybe in another donor-advised fund, and then the grants are administered under the advice of a donor advisor. In the case of the tar sands campaign, it's Sephora Berman, who acts in conjunction with, she consults with all the recipient organizations and strategizes about what the purpose, where is the money going to go. And she consults with the donor foundations. And as a result of those consultations, agreements are reached about how these funds are going to be distributed. And then they come out of accounts held at the Tides Foundation. But Tides does not itself grant any of its own money.
Now, this is very interesting because as I'm listening to you, I don't see anything unethical, illegal, unusual. This is business as usual for the foundations, as I understand it. And what happened on the Canadian side with Sephora Berman and others who distributed the funds, or however, whatever they did with the Engos, that was all kosher. There was no, the Canada Revenue Agency has conducted audits of some of those environmental groups, the charities, and found, as far as I can tell, found nothing. So really what we have here is business as usual and no hanky-panky. There's no nothing untoward. It's been the researchers and the politicians who have taken and twisted this narrative. Have I got that right?
I would say so. I mean, I don't know how much the politicians actually really understand this world, or whether, I don't know whether it's political opportunism. I don't know whether it's ignorance. I don't know what their frame of mind is, but they clearly do not understand the financial apparatus and infrastructure that is built around the charitable donation grants. Effectively, these donor advised funds, like Tides, are effectively banks. In fact, the large financial institutions like Schwab's, Fidelity, there are a number of them, and they are also operating these donor advised funds. This is perfectly normal. It is accepted. In fact, it is expected. 90% of international grants flow through on exactly this model. And if you want to get finicky about it, you know, a lot of governments around the world want to shut down environmentalists. They want to shut down women's rights activists, human rights activists, and they are, around the world, they are cracking down on and human rights and environmental activists. This is affecting women's access to contraception, girls' access to education. A huge amount of efforts are being undertaken by some pretty draconian governments around the world under the guise of protecting their people from foreign interference.
So what we have here is a government in Alberta, but you know, supported by the Moe government in Saskatchewan and supported by the Andrew Scheer when he was leading the Conservative Party of Canada. And really, when you pull back and take a bigger picture of this, there's more going on than just the tar sands campaign and concern over that. This looks like this is part of a global movement to crack down on activism and some of these activities that the foundations are funding. So best we understand that as context, but I think we've covered a lot of ground here, Sandy. Any final thoughts?
I just want Canadians, I think it's really important for Canadians to appreciate that our voices matter, and that Canadian environmentalists and nonprofit organizations and charities are and should be as free as corporations to accept funding from international sources. And they are and should be as free as corporations to freely advocate in the public realm according to their own best lights. We have clear rules about what is and is not allowed in terms of partisan conduct by charities. And as far as I know, almost all Canadian charities that are active in this sector are following the rules. And I haven't seen any evidence of any problems, any significant problems of any kind.
Sandy, thank you very much for this. Now, I hope I never have to interview you again on this topic. I hope it withers on the vine and eventually and very quickly is not an issue anymore. Thank you very much for doing this interview, and we'll look forward to other interviews, but about other topics.
My pleasure, Markham. Nice to see you.